Some of you have probably heard over the past few years bits and pieces of this Global 2000 study story, but likely not in this capacity. So I think we're all excited tonight to hear the full story and put all the pieces together. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jerry, the founder and trustee, for our task.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is the first time that I've ever told this whole story. So I want to start by kind of looking at the context for it. In 1972, there was a study published called The Limits to Growth. And that study was based on a computer model of the world. The first one that I know of. It was at MIT. And this is the output from the standard run. As you can see, it shows population growing, industrial output growing, resources declining, pollution increasing, up until about 2010 or 15, and then things begin to decline. In fact, there's kind of an uncontrollable decline in industrial output and population and food and a lot of things. Now, it turns out there are ways in which you can change that, but if you're going to change it, it required changes in the policies of the world. Now, about that same time, in 1977, there was an environmental message sent from President Carter to the Congress. And also at that time, I was working at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and published a book called The Unfinished Agenda, which gathered together the thinking of all of the large membership environmental groups as to what the environmental problems of the future were. So this is kind of the context. And then there was a call to Washington. That book that I just showed you, it was 6 months from the time we decided to do it until we were having a press conference, an all-day press conference, in the caucus room of the House of Representatives. And I'll tell you, that was 6 months of really hard work. So Carol and I and our family, our kids, were on vacation in Bar Harbor, Maine. And I called my office just to check in from the campground. And there was a call from Washington from somebody named Charles Warren that I had never heard of before. And he asked me to call, so I did. And he explained that in that document that we just looked at, that there was a directive for a study of the future of the world. And Warren wanted to know if I would be willing to come to Washington to interview for it. And after talking with Carol, briefly, we decided that I should go. So when I got there, I was able to see the directive. And as you can see, it's short. It's just 2 pages. It was published in 23-page document. And for the interview, coming from the campground, I had a windbreaker and some chinos, and I bought a tie on the way at the airport. And then started into some negotiations with Mr. Warren. The thing that I liked about this study directive is that it didn't call for just another study. There had been a lot of, by that time, 3 or 4 studies of the world that essentially arrived at the same conclusions. But this said the purpose of the study is to establish a foundation for longer-term planning. And I thought that made the project really worthwhile doing. So in the course of the negotiations, I said I wanted to focus not just on developing projections, but to establish this foundation, and to do that, to have a look at all of the models that the U.S. government is using to look at the future of the world. And in the process, I wanted also to look into the models to see how they worked, what their assumptions were. And he reluctantly agreed to that. Then I told him that I wanted to be sure that we kept control over the report until it was time for its release. So I wanted a safe. I wanted a security clearance because I wanted to know what was going on that I might otherwise not be able to have access to. So during the course of the study, I had a top secret clearance, and actually beyond a top secret clearance. And I asked that I be allowed to work directly with the government printing office on arranging the printing. And Warren agreed and then said, "When can you start?" Well, first I had to go to the State Department and have an interview with Patsy Mink because she, well, the State Department was to do the study jointly with the Council on Environmental Quality. So, okay, the study took place in a different world than you live in, or that I live in now. And here's the door to that different world. That's the door, the entry into the Council on Environmental Quality, which is a part of the Executive Office of the President. And when you go through that, you're in a different world. There's suits, there's ties, there's people that are very fussy. It's a high tension, high pressure area to work. The key people that I worked with were Charles Warren, the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. Gus Beth was a member. Ed Strobane was the executive director. Kitty Gilman was the editor. Tom Delaney, the administrative officer. And Bill Long was the person that we worked with mostly at the State Department. The first day was a surprise. August 23rd, that's when I started. The 1 year for the study started the minute the president had signed the document, which was May 23rd. And it turned out they had spent 3 months looking for me. And the government printing office informed me that they needed 3 months to print. So the 12 months that I was to have to do a study of the future of the world for the president got shrunk down to 6 months on that first day. And Mr. Warren said, "By the way, we don't have any money. We've got money to pay your salary, but no more. There's no staff, and we don't have any office space." So that was the way the first day began. So I began working then with Mr. Warren, who was a former, I think, state of California senator. And he was the one who introduced the legislation and got it passed in California that prevented the building of any new nuclear power plants until such time as there was a plan for dealing with the waste from those plants. And I thought that was a brilliant thing to do. And so I enjoyed working with Charlie. The study process that I recommended was that, of course, we're going to have to make some policy assumptions. So that would be here. There will be population projections, and I want those as inputs to everything else. I want a climate scenario that goes into the resource projections. And there are technical assumptions. You know, what kind of technology are we going to have? How will that change over time? And there's the economic projections that feed into all the resource projections. So those are the things that I wanted. And then the resource projections would produce environmental implications or impacts. And we would then analyze what those impacts would be. And there would also be some feedback from the environmental projections to the resource projections themselves. Okay, if we're going to get this done in 6 months, we've got to take some action. So when I asked Warren about the money, he said, well, there is an executive group, and we're going to ask all of the agencies to chip in to cover the costs. So the things that I had to tell the executive group was that we need them to actually do the projections, and I'd have to have the draft of them in 6 months or in 3 months. And we had a core team that was going to do the analysis of the model and the synthesis of the projections. and that we're going to need some funding. Now, we ended up having an advisory group. I did not want an advisory group, I'll have to tell you, because having done that unfinished agenda book, I know that if you're going to try to get a big study done in a short time, you don't need a bunch of advisors looking over your shoulder and telling you what to do. But I lost that battle, and so there was an advisory group established. And to deal with that, I went around to all of the people that were involved in the study and said, who should be on the advisory group? And they all gave me the names and the addresses, and I proceeded to go ahead and write a letter to everybody. And then at the next meeting, they asked, how many are there? I said, 135. You know, they can't all look over my shoulder. So the advisory group quickly got forgotten, but it became very important later on, and I'll tell you why. Then Tom Delaney became a very important man. He was the administrative officer, and it was decided after I got there that CEQ didn't have enough space to take on another person. So I was given a contract, and it was 3 days before the close of the fiscal year, and at the end of the fiscal year, the money disappeared. So I had to find a way to get incorporated in 3 days, and I thought, oh, good, we'll have a contract. That'll be a page or so. The contract I signed was about 35 pages, just to take on the responsibility for the study. And then Tom Delaney was the person I had to talk to about space. Okay, the executive group. Here's whom I was dealing with. You know, the State Department, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior, USAID, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the CIA. I had all of those groups that were working for me at that time. Okay, the first meeting of the executive group, Mr. Warren introduced me and then said, and Mr. Barney will tell you about how we're going to do this. Well, I don't know about you, but growing up on a little farm in rural Oregon, I was a little intimidated to be talking to that audience. But, you know, my feeling is I'm the Earth, and I believe the Earth wants this study done. So what I did is I kept my feet firmly on the floor and then just went ahead and said what I felt had to be said. And it worked. I started and said, we've got 6 months to do this study. And here's the plan, how we're going to link all these projections. You guys from the agencies have to do the projections. I need chapters of a report written from each of you. We're going to need the final projections by about the end of November. And by the way, we're going to need about $60,000 from each of you. And then, you know, I had no idea how this group was going to react, but Jim Morrison from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was the first one to speak. And he said, loudly and clearly, this study is really important, and NOAA will fully support it. You'll have our $60,000 by the end of the week. Now, he was a little optimistic in how fast he could get his bureaucracy to work, but by making that statement, he made it very difficult for anybody else in the room to say, no, we don't want anything to do with this. So he was one of the heroes of the study in just what he did there. Okay, one of the next crises, and there were many, was that the agencies began to refuse to write the chapters and do the projections. Here on the left side here are the projections that we needed. and the red ones are the ones that they refuse to write. And the black ones are the ones that they did do. These two down here in purple are the ones that we did, the core staff, the non-fuel minerals part and the environment part. The non-fuel minerals part was kind of interesting. It was supposed to have been done by the Department of the Interior. I went to a meeting with the Assistant Secretary, and his top technical person was due to come. And a guy came a little late, but he had 2 suitcases with him, big ones. And I thought, you know, we were lucky. We must have caught him on the way to the airport. But in short order, he opened the suitcases, and they were full of documents. And he pulled out one document after another, and he said, you wanted to know this. Okay, that's covered on pages 435 to 730. Okay, you wanted to know this. That's in this document. And, you know, in short order, I had a stack of documents that high on my lap, and he refused to participate. So, and the environment, we thought the Environmental Protection Agency would do the global environmental report, but they refused to do it. They were too busy. So we had to deal with that. Now, the office. Tom Delaney, bless his heart, found space for us. And this was where our office was. He put us in the basement in an area where broken furniture and boxes and so forth were there. There was a room in there that had been the photocopy room years ago, and this is the entrance to the Global 2000 Study office right there. And we had company there. There were rats, big, healthy rats, and cockroaches aplenty that were running around. So this is where I sat inside that little office. You can see the safe that we got here. And then the core staff. I mentioned Story Shim. Story had been a part of the advance team for President Carter. And so she was assigned to work on this by the State Department. She had a position at the State Department. So she was working with me, and when I found out about this, I thought to myself, what on earth am I going to do with an advanced person? You know, she wanted to write the plan for release of the study. Oh my gosh. You know, I was so far from being ready for doing that. But I asked Story to take on the job of following up with each of the agencies to get that $60,000 from each one. And she was fantastic. She just did such a good job, and really managed to bring it all off. Then the environment chapter. I had to hire somebody to do that. And I hired Jenny Robinson, who was just out of school at Dartmouth. There's a picture of her. And I sat her down and I said, Jenny, we need a chapter dealing with the environment of the whole planet. Will you please take it on? She did. She wrote a very good chapter in 6 weeks. And I thought that was pretty amazing. Okay, Peter van der Werf did the non-fuel minerals part. This is we finally not only got the basement, but we got a bit of space in the attic. It was unfinished, but Tom Delaney managed to get some money to put drywall on the sides there. And then part of the negotiation I had was that we get to look under the hood at all the government's models. This is Ned Dearborn. He was the guy who went through all that technical documentation, the equations and everything that were in all of the models, to explain in layman's terms what was right and what was wrong with all those models. His conclusion at the end was that the executive agencies of the U.S. government are not now capable of presenting the president with an internally consistent set of projections of world trends in population, resources, and the environment for the next 2 decades. Now, the best we could do was to get that sentence published on page 454 of volume 2, because that was not what the government wanted to say. They did not want to say, as it turns out, that there are some very serious problems and our analytical capabilities are not up to snuff. They didn't want to say that. Okay, this is more of the staff. This is Jeff McClure. He was my right-hand man for following up on a lot of things. And he, I think, was 23 at the time. But that is the Global 2000 study. And Louise Neely and Alvin Edwards were the people who typed that. You know, we didn't have word processors then. And, you know, now we talk about cut and paste. That's exactly what we did. You know, when there was a page of text that we needed to make a change in, we would type the change on a separate page, we'd cut the page and tape it in and photocopy it. That's where cut and paste came from. We were actually doing it. Okay. Now, new crisis. Nobody was writing anything. You know, there were no drafts coming in. And I didn't want to be, I had to work with these people for a long time, so I did not want to play the heavy and, you know, go to their bosses and say, hey, these people are not producing the work we need. So instead what I did is the Smithsonian has a conference center called the Belmont House up in Maryland. And I scheduled a 2-day weekend retreat meeting and took all those people with me out to that conference and center, and we had each one of them stand up and tell what they were doing. And of course, if you're on the agenda that you're going to stand up in front of a bunch of peers, you get busy and get your work done. And that they did. Another thing that proved really interesting, and I think one of the most valuable things out of the whole study, is that we had together for 2 full days in this building all of the long-term global thinkers in the entire U.S. government. There were about 12, maybe 15 of them there, and not one of them had ever met any of the others. The population guys didn't know the food guys didn't know the energy people didn't know the water, none of them. So we got them acquainted. Then Kitty Gilman, the editor, was appointed to be, she got promoted to be the senior staff member for international environmental affairs. I thought it was a rather breathtaking big promotion to go from being the chief editor to that position. But in that position, she began to have an influence on the study. And a first key thing that she did is she persuaded Mr. Warren that it would be good if we had a review by government experts of this chapter that Jenny Robinson had written in 6 weeks. Jenny, by this time, had gone on to take a job at the International Institute for System Dynamics in Austria. So Gilman organized this and got people from various agencies of the government to come and read what Jenny had written. And they criticized it extensively. And it took me a year to get that cleaned up and agreed for publishing. It ended up being a chapter of 222 pages, and Kitty demanded there be footnotes on essentially everything. So there were 776 footnotes in that chapter. When we got it all finished, and I thought we could go on to something else, Kitty demanded that we go back to the library and check to see that we had the page numbers correct in every reference. Okay, then I hired a fellow named Ken Sherfy. He wanted to be a composer, and he always traveled around with on a beat-up bicycle. And with a tape recorder. And as he would think of a new melody, he would stop his bicycle and sing this new melody into his tape recorder, put it back in his backpack, and go on. Well, Ken was equipped with a clipboard and a list of 776 references, and he bicycled to libraries all over Washington for a long time to get that done. And here's a picture of Ken. Then there was a change of leadership. Charles Warren went back to California. Gus Speth was appointed chairman. Patsy Mink was replaced by Thomas Pickering. And here is Gus Speth. At about this point, I wrote what I called a decision memorandum. And I said, you know, anything that you try to do in a very short period of time is going to have a conflict between high quality and getting it done on time. And we're to the point now where, you know, we could print what we have, but it needs to be cleaned up further. And to do that, it's going to require a bit more time. So I persuaded them to give me a little bit more time to work on the study, but not enough that I could really hire people and keep going and get it done. So it was an inadequate staffing. Now, at this time, Kitty Gilman began writing drafts of the summary report. And there is this technical volume, and there is this summary report of 50 pages. And she started writing drafts of that summary report. And when she'd write a draft, she would circulate it, and I would review it, and I'd find that it had been watered down so much that it hardly even looked like it was recognizable from the work that we'd done. So I would put the substance back in and circulate it, and Kitty would take it and rewrite it and take the substance out and water it down. And it went through 14 drafts of it increasingly getting watered down. Then on December 4th, 1979, Kitty distributed her final draft, so to speak. And I was told to read it and get my comments back to Kitty. But instead I did something else. I wrote this little chit, and I made copies of Kitty's draft, and I sent it around to all of the agencies that were contributing to the study, and crossed my fingers, because I needed support from the agencies saying, let's put the substance back in this study. And government bureaucrats are not known for wanting to, you know, put substance into things. That they tend generally to water things down. So I was taking a chance that they would support me. And they did. They wrote back reviews of that chapter. And finally, I wrote what I called my major concerns memo to the chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality and the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and Environmental Matters, Thomas Pickering. And in summary, I said, you guys are the political bosses on this, and you can make the decision as to what kind of a report you want to produce. But as a study director, I think I have to tell you that if you put out anything like this draft, latest draft from Kitty Gilman, it is not going to reflect well on the Council on Environmental Quality or the Department of State, and is likely to be a serious embarrassment to the President. You know, that was not received with enthusiasm, but it did allow me to get back into the writing process. And I was given 2 weeks to write a draft of that 50 pages as an alternative to what Kitty had written. And then things got more interesting. Ed Dearborn, you remember him? He's the one who's analyzing all the models. He took it upon himself to start writing letters to the staff at the White House saying that there was a Watergate-style cover-up in progress at the Council on Environmental Quality. And, you know, sending me copies of those letters, and so I had to take those letters and take them to Gus Speth and say, I'm sorry, but one of my staff members has taken it upon himself to write letters to the staff at the White House telling them that there's a problem here. Well, let me tell you, that did not go over well. And Gus then stopped meeting with me and had his well, I would call him a hatchet man, Ed Strobane, meet with me. Okay, I had other work to do. So what was this other work? Well, Kitty had written her draft, and so I was supposed to comment on that draft. And Kitty didn't know a lot of things about the environment or about projections or models or anything. So she had lots and lots of questions that I had to answer. And I was finishing the edits and the rewrites on Volume 2. And when Limits to Growth was published, they didn't have a technical volume. This technical volume was published 2 years after Limits to Growth came out. And let me tell you, that team got butchered by critics because they didn't have any technical backup to support what they did. And the last thing I wanted was to publish the Global 2000 study without the technical backup. So when it came to starting to write the summary, I wanted to slow down on that until such time as we got the technical report done. And then something happened at EPA. The head of the international office, Lewis Hughes, died of cancer. And EPA decided that they wanted to block the publication of the technical volume, this thing. So we had a major problem in trying to figure out how we could get someone at EPA to read this enough to persuade the assistant administrator that this was good work and should be published. So that was one other little task that I had to deal with. Then there was a cover design. This is a rather unique design for a cover. You don't see many government reports that look anything like that. It was my idea that it should be a brushstroke on a canvas background as a way of kind of talking about the fact that this was a broad brush study. It was looking off upward into the future. And there was a lot of debate about it, but finally it was agreed that that was a good design, and we got it done. But that took a lot of time. And then there was a contract to be signed for the preparation of the third volume of the study on the government's global model. And then one of my friends, a fellow named John Richardson, got a contract with the State Department to do some work on the study. And he proceeded to write a letter summarizing the findings of the study and send it to several hundred of his friends. You know, that was a violation of the terms on which he had access to the report, and it did not help at all in the release of the study. Then you saw where our office was and all the boxes and stuff that were there. I had to find space for 5,000 copies of this report because the government printing office couldn't store them. So I had to work on that. And then we wanted a commercial publisher, Pergamon Press wanted to do it, so I had to work with them on getting a contract, and I had to look for a job, as this was going to end, and the leave of absence I had from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund had expired. So I was busy. So here's a memo from EPA proposing that we kill the second volume. But soon thereafter, I got a victory. This is a picture of the first page of the page proofs of the second volume of the Global 2000 study, the part that really had the substance in it. And on February 22nd, 1980, I was able to go to the government printing office and write "OK to print" on the upper right-hand corner of that. And that was a victory, because I knew that if that was out, it would, the study would begin to have some impact. Well, there was the Kitty draft, there was a draft that I produced in 2 weeks, and so we had to produce a merged draft. And in the process of merger, we could lose the substance. Gus had a meeting with Kitty and told her what he wanted done for the merger. And he had a separate meeting with me and told me what he wanted. I wrote up my notes from what happened there, and what I wrote is that Jerry was going to take on this real substantive part of the writing of the merger. And then Gus left town, and by the time he got back, I had it done. So I was able to keep a lot of the substance in place. Then as we got closer to releasing the study, there was a dilemma that I had designed into the study from the very beginning. And that there was a part talking about the future of the world, there was a part that's talking about the foundation for longer-term planning. And the part about the substance, the first sentence was, if the present trends, and it was not supposed to be trends, but policies, but I couldn't win that battle. Anyway, the present trends continue. The world in 2000 will be more crowded, more polluted, less stable ecologically, and more vulnerable to disruption than the world we live in now. And then the executive agencies do not have the capacity to present the president with a coherent set of projections. So if you're the PR person for the State Department or the Council on Environmental Quality, what do you do with a report that's saying there's some damn serious problems facing this country and the world? And Mr. President, we don't have the capacity to do a decent job of telling you about them. Well, I have to say I kind of enjoyed watching the squirming that came with that. But it was true. Okay, then some events. We had a briefing for the White House staff. And there's a list of them here. Stuart Eisenstadt, some of you will remember him, Pat Caddell, so forth. After the briefing, I was kind of at the point where Gus didn't think he needed me much longer. I was taken to his office and given a 45-minute tongue lashing like you cannot believe. And about that time, Gus told me that he had arranged with the president that there be a task force established to make recommendations on what to do following the study. But there would be no role in that for me, that I had been too hard-headed, too difficult to deal with, and I was out of the picture. Okay, July 24, 1980, we released a study in the White House press room. And here we are. The far left here is Thomas Pickering, was Assistant Secretary of State. This is Ev Muskie, then the Secretary of State. Gus Beth is the Chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality. And this is Gerald Barney. And my guidance at this press conference was to say only what was in the report, no comment, no embellishment of any kind, only to stay with what Speth and his team had approved. And here's what I looked like then. Okay, that was the end. Or in a way, it was the beginning. This is a stack of press clippings. I didn't get near all of them, but there are 500 pages of press clippings on that study. So now, why is Global 2000 of interest to our task? Well, the first thing I'd say is, for all of you young people, this could have been you. You know, I just grew up on a little bitty farm in rural Oregon and never ever expected to be working on a study of the future of the world in the executive office of the president. But I did, and that could happen to you. So be brave and do it. And I want also to say that I think it's important because of the sense of the stakes that are involved. Currently, we are planning the future of every country on the idea of trying to maximize the increase in growth that we can achieve. More and more GDP is what we want. But anybody who's studied even first-year physics knows that you cannot have infinite growth in a finite space. So there is no way that we can have growth continue indefinitely on this planet. But that's what's being done, what's being planned. And I hope this talk will give you a little context for your Global 2100 project. Because, you know, these growth trends are continuing. I think there's a lot to be learned from that Limits to Growth study. And I'm sorry to say that many environmental studies programs don't even mention it, but there's a lot to be learned from it. And you can level these things off, but we've lost a lot of opportunities since that study was published in 1972. So we need change, we need a big change now. How did I feel? You know, some of you may remember Philippe Petit walking on a cable between the towers of the World Trade Center. He said afterward, when you're young, when you're a young person, the world is yours, and you can do the impossible. What he did at the World Trade Center was impossible. It took him 6 years to do it. He had to carry a ton of equipment secretly to the roof of the World Trade Center in order to make that walk. What I did was impossible too. Getting that study done was a miracle again and again. And it was nice when I finally did get to meet Jimmy Carter. And as I walked into his office in Atlanta, he put out his hand to shake hands and he said, I want you to know that I know where all 3 volumes of your study are in the bookshelf in my bedroom. So that's the end of the talk, and it's open for questions and I hope some answers. Yes. Yes. Please,
So,
Anthony.
2 questions. Take them in reverse chronological order. During the last part of the time that you're talking about, during 1980, when you were trying really hard to get that published, it was also an election year. Did they come in and talk to you? I mean, did that impact the situation that you were in, and if so, how?
Okay, what's the second one?
The second one is with your chart from the 1972. You just put it up on the screen a moment ago, and to me, it looks like a fairly typical Malthusian curve, and the actual projection, the timeline, it may happen, but it's been predicted again and again and again, but the industrial production hasn't dropped yet. Global industrial production and our country's economic production continue to go up at this point. How did you account for those kind of curves? Have been out there since the 19th century, and the time keeps pushing. So how did you deal with that particular aspect?
Okay. The first question, how did the election figure into this?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know why there was the effort to water down the analysis, but because I was never allowed to sit in on the meetings in which the motives were being discussed. But Story Shim, having been part of the Carter Advance team, got in a lot of places. And what she came back to tell me was that the reason they wanted this watered down is that Mr. Speth aspired to be the chief of staff of the second Carter administration, and he did not feel that it would be helpful to helpful to his career to put out a report that had a lot of difficult questions and no answers just before the election. Now, I don't know whether that's true or it is not, but it's plausible to me. Now, the election was influenced by the Iranian hostage crisis. And if you think carefully about that, I think that these issues in a lot of ways were behind that event. I think these issues are behind the attacks in Paris. I think they're behind a lot of things in the world. Now, how did I deal with that? In a way, I didn't. I asked the Energy Department to make its projections based on its assumptions. The population, the Bureau of the Census, to make its projections and so forth. But I didn't tell them, make it Malthusian or not make it Malthusian. So do what you think is the case. The result, the projections that we got, didn't go beyond 2000. Mm-hmm. So you could not compare them directly with the limits to growth projections. So I couldn't say in the end that this confirms limits or it doesn't. But I'll say that there is a good, reputable study that was published about 4 or 5 months ago that went back and looked at all of the trends that are taking place since the study was published. And the data are really right close on track with what the projections were. So, but if that means it's going to fall way off, I don't know. We'll have to say, but I have studied that model very carefully, and I think the assumptions in it, the analysis deserves a lot more attention than it has received to date. How about another question? Yes.
Did the report consider it was global in terms of all projections, or have a kind of analysis, regionally speaking, in terms of the regions of the world where what's happening in America, in the Americas, or in Africa, or in Asia? So it has a kind of geographical perspective too.
There were projections for population and for the resources and for the environment. And those were all done by the individual agencies. And most of them were geographically disaggregated down to a national level, but not below national level. And for the core team who did the synthesis, we didn't really have the capacity to get into a more geographically disaggregated level than that. Yeah. Yes?
We have a virtual question.
A virtual question.
So Harsh would like to know, what is the most important lesson you learned during the Global 2000 report that you think we can take away for the Global 2100 report?
Well, I think maybe the lesson that's most important is to recognize that currently the world is being managed by the collective decision-making of, what, 165 countries or so. There is no real global decision maker. There's no place where somebody is thinking about the future of the entire planet. I had a clearance, a security clearance that was so secret that I couldn't even be told what it was until after I had the clearance. And once I had the clearance, I went to the CIA and I talked with them. I said, I want to know where in this government, there's got to be somewhere in the Defense Department or here at CIA or somewhere where somebody is thinking about the future of the planet as a whole and the role, the position of this country in the overall picture. The answer was no. There is no place that's doing that. And I see nothing, I don't have any clearance anymore, but I see nothing that leads me to think that that has changed. So I think that the biggest lesson is that we are currently, all the billions of us that we are, we're trusting a system of organization of the entire population of the planet into nation states, all of whom feel that they have complete sovereignty and can do whatever they want within their national borders, and that no power on earth can interfere with them doing that, and paying no attention to the combined consequences of their individual action. And that's why I think it is so vital that we have in our task and that you do a Global 2100 study. But when you do it, don't be surprised if you get a lot of criticism, because you are going to be raising fundamental questions about assumptions that are made surrounding the whole nation-state system and the whole economic planning for the planet. That's what I think. Harsh, thanks for a good question. Yes.
In your studies, did you find any example, however small, of a trend going in the opposite direction?
Excuse me?
Of a trend going in the opposite direction, not following the Malthusian curve, but maybe earlier in the Malthusian curve, so you can only see the up part and not the down part. Was there any bright spot that you found?
Is there hope?
Yes.
And what was different about that small area that might give hope for the future?
Well,
or was it really 100.00% where you found nothing?
it was not a lot. You know, be perfectly frank. It was not a lot. And, but I do see, certainly now I see individuals, I see, you know, small jurisdictions that are doing things that are constructive. I think Arlington's doing quite a job good job on reducing energy consumption here. I think a lot has been done to increase education for women and girls, and I think that has in turn had a big impact on fertility rates, desired family size. I think we are aware, much more aware now than we were when I was doing this, of the importance of climate change. And so I think there's a lot of things to be hopeful about. But I have to say there's 35 years that have gone by, and there's a lot we could have done in those 35 years that we didn't do. And it means that for young people, the options are much smaller. And you know, my sense is if you look at the ecological footprint for the planet, you know, you see that curve going up and the line going across, saying, you know, this is where we've got one planet for a footprint, but we're well above that now. We're 1.5 planets just to do sustainably what we're doing now, but we don't have 1.5 planets. I think in '72 it would have been possible to bring that down to a soft landing. Now I think there is going to be some really unpleasant things happen. And the attacks in Paris, I think, were perhaps an example of it. And I think that, you know, the lesson that I draw from Paris is that we have to recognize that we can't expect to live in peace in Europe or in the United States when millions and millions and billions of people are living in war. That we have to be concerned about how are we going to bring those wars to an end. And those wars are not going to end unless people feel that they're being justly treated and allowed to have access to the resources of the planet that are needed for them to and their families to survive. So there's a lot of big moral questions, I think, that are left, and the biggest questions are probably going to be about ourselves, about understanding who we are and why we behave the way we do, and why we're reluctant to help other people in the world. Yeah. Yes, my friend Max.
Well, since I am a very passionate environmentalist and plan on doing whatever I can to help make the Global 2100 project happen, it seems like there are a lot of setbacks that you faced and a lot of challenges, and I was wondering what challenges do you think we're going to face when we try to put this report together?
Well, you won't face many of the ones I did because you're not dealing with a bureaucracy. You don't have to get clearance from a bureaucracy to put out your report. But you will have to find a way to come to an agreement that your report is saying what you want to say, that it reflects the opinions and the thinkings of young people. So that will be a challenge as to how do you put it together, how are you going to be satisfied that everybody's voice has been heard. There is a big challenge by way of how do you deal with the interrelatedness of things. There are lots of reports about the future of food, and there are other reports about the future of energy, and there's others about, you know, the future of mangroves or whatever. But the real challenge is to figure out how to integrate these things with all the interdependence that is there. And you know, the principal tools that are used mostly in economic analysis are equilibrium analysis. They're assuming everything's in equilibrium or making a projection to a new equilibrium. But in fact, there's there's a lot of dynamic change in there that is very, very, very important. And I have to say that I was very fortunate to have a year of postdoctoral studies at MIT where I learned about system dynamics. And this is kind of the principal text about that now, but I know of no methodology, no tool anywhere near as powerful as system dynamics at dealing with all the interconnectedness of things. So I think that will be a challenge. And another challenge is that I think will be real and that you have to help each other with, and that your parents and the rest of us have to help you with, is getting depressed. And the closing the loop part of the environment chapter of Global 2000, I wrote that. It took me about 10 days to write that, and I sat in our basement and wrote day after day after day in tears because it was so depressing to write it. And you're going to find that too when you get into it. It is terribly depressing. And I'd say, you know, the only thing you can do, I think, to really account or deal with it is to talk with your peers, talk with others, talk with your parents, talk with anybody you can about it. But try to be honest with them and explain to them that as a young person today, it is terribly, terribly frightening to think seriously about your future. And it's frustrating because I think there are young people who've got real good ideas, but my gosh, the amount of influence you can have is really limited. But I think it's hopeful because one way or another, you are going to live to see a new world. It is going to change. It may not change the way we'd like it, but it is going to change. And your generation is unlike any other generation that's ever lived, because you are going to live to see the transition through whatever is to come. And I think it should be inspiring to you to take on a project like Global 2100 and say, we're going to do our best to make things go this way, not this way.
Beat the vested interests of those who want to go that way.
More? Anthony.
Just building on, is it Max?
Max, yeah.
Yeah, on what Max said. Maybe you care to comment on this. I think that another challenge that you might face is how to bring in voices that are really marginalized, like the people who live in some of those places that have the wars, that have limited access and limited resource to be part of the conversation, and how you can, in what ways, I mean, the internet is so powerful, maybe that's a tool, but in what ways can you reach out to those marginalized voices to get their ideas, to get an understanding of who they are and how they live and what's important to them, because that seems really important, and I don't know the answer. I don't know if Jerry has answers to that idea too, but those people seem important.
They are important. And I don't have any perfect answer to that, no. I'm not even sure that my generation is up to the task. I think the younger people have got better ideas about how to connect and reach out to people than mine does. But yeah, good. Thanks for the question. Yes.
Question with the art from 100.
Chris, right?
Yeah, Chris. Is, I think the general population all knows and is aware, but who's pointing to the specifics of what needs to get done? done. And question on the report. I know what it's going to report, and I know it's going to be alarming, but is it also going to be in the report what needs to get done in more specific terms to emphasize this is the course of action and where we need to go and put our resources right now, our economics, our political power behind? Because I think everybody knows global warming from the debates, and we know it's not a sustainable issue. But specifically, where do we go from here?
Well, Sonia, you are a lot closer to that than I am. Would you care to talk about the balance that you're trying to achieve in talking about changes that are needed, as opposed to describing alarming trends?
Yeah, what we hope to do after the Global 2000 project is to look at all the alternative plans that are out there, written by young people, written by scholars, written by by people across the world that say we can't just continue on this current path and we can do it differently, and this is the way to do it, or this is an example of what we can do to make the changes. So we will look at these alternative plan Bs and blog about them, spread the word, talk about it together on forums. And what we would like to do is to collect all these plan Bs and our plan Bs and our thinking together, what we call in a youth plan B. We will set out surveys to connect, hopefully, also with the marginalized people across the world and see what they think, what issues they see in their own environment, how they address these issues on a local level and on a high level. But we hope to collect as many sort of ideas, plan Bs, voices of the young people across the world and put them in a plan, what we call a youth plan B. And hopefully this will outline more solutions of what we can do as a global society to tackle at least some of the issues, and also how we can, not only that, but we already know that some of these issues that, what you said, we crossed the line, so we have to live with it. So what does that mean? So I hope that answered your question. Do you have anything to add, Ken?
No, I think she said it well. I mean, part of the whole idea is to get other voices involved, get other people to share their ideas, and how are we going to solve these problems? How are we going to make a difference? How are we going to change the world in a sense? So, okay.
I think we're going to adjourn soon, but I'd like to close by telling you a story about my youngest son, Steve. He was in the 4th grade when Global 2000 was published. And when Carol and I went for our first meeting with his teacher, the teacher explained that on the first day of school, she asked the students, one after another, to stand up and introduce themselves to the class and to tell the class what their father did for a living. And she said, Steve stood up and said, "My name is Stephen Barney, and my father writes telephone books." Well, thank you for listening.